Sheffield, 1944. Mess hall doors burst wide, exposing a timber crate positioned upon a forward table. Cables snaked toward a wall outlet. The atmosphere electrified with expectation that seized the throat. Across the packed chamber, German captives abandoned their twilight exchanges, their gazes fixed upon the apparatus that had materialized during meal preparations. They understood what awaited them from British propaganda, fabrications, perversions, meticulously engineered falsehoods calculated to shatter German resolve and corrupt minds against the homeland. What emerged from that radio speaker instead silenced every noise in the chamber. A British announcer's voice, composed and deliberate, delivering reports that contradicted nothing within their knowledge, succeeded by a German-language transmission that bore no resemblance to propaganda whatsoever. For an instant, 300 souls suspended breathing as one. Everything drilled into them regarding enemy information manipulation, regarding British deception protocols, regarding how conquerors rewrote reality stood ready for examination against something unanticipated, unfiltered truth. If you've persisted this far, you embody precisely the individual who preserves history's pulse. Execute one action for me, strike like so, this narrative escapes burial. Demonstrate commitment through subscription to capture the approaching chapter, and circulate this video so additional souls uncover the truth history sought to conceal. The path to this instant had commenced 6 weeks prior on a frigid Normandy dawn. Ernst Bauer positioned himself among 250 souls within a provisional detention enclosure near Cannes, his Panzer crew uniform still bearing petroleum marks from the tank that had absorbed direct impact 3 days earlier. He numbered 31 years, a tank commander who had battled from North Africa through France across 3 years of conflict. Surrounding him, infantry soldiers, artillery crews, logistics personnel, even a military correspondent from Berlin who had documented the Atlantic Wall, all seized as the Allied eruption from Normandy demolished German defensive formations. They had anticipated swift interrogation, likely torture. The propaganda had been explicit. The British were architects of psychological manipulation, authorities at extracting intelligence through refined mental torment, masters at shattering men's essence through deception masked as compassion. Instead, they obtained medical attention, heated sustenance, and conveyance to Britain under conditions that, though austere, honored fundamental human worth. The Channel passage proved wretched, yet not barbarous. Seasickness that voided stomachs, cold that invaded woolen uniforms, and darkness interrupted solely by guard circuits. Men occupied silence, some praying, others consumed by thoughts of families they might never witness again, still others attempting mental preparation for whatever psychological warfare awaited them in Britain. Ernst maintained a diminutive notebook concealed in his boot, inscribing in microscopic script when guards diverted attention. September 7, 1944. We traveled to England. The propaganda cautioned us that British installations employ refined methods to fracture prisoners psychologically, radio transmissions saturated with deceptions, counterfeit intelligence engineered to generate doubt about Germany. I shall resist. I must retain what is authentic. The English rain differed from French rain upon disembarkation at Dover, gentler yet more relentless, descending in curtains that rendered the world grey and obscure, saturating through garments with patient certainty. Men descended gangways onto piers where British soldiers awaited with the casual precision that appeared to characterize their every action. No theatrical brutality, yet no warmth either, purely professional processing of enemy captives according to established procedures. British guards loaded them onto trains heading northward. The journey consumed hours through countryside appearing impossibly unmarred by war, verdant fields, undamaged villages, factories with smokestacks generating industrial output, infrastructure that continued functioning. Everything in direct opposition to what propaganda had proclaimed about Britain nearing collapse, about cities annihilated by German bombardment, about a nation starving and desperate. One captive, a lieutenant named Klaus Weber, murmured, they proclaimed Britain was finished. Yet observe this, everything operates, everything functions. No one replied. The cognitive fracture proved too immediate, too overwhelming to process within a single train passage. Camp 17 materialized from the Yorkshire hillside like something extracted from an alternate realm. Rows of timber huts arranged in precise formation, wire barriers that enclosed without oppressing, guard towers occupied by soldiers appearing bored rather than threatening. The camp commandant was a British major named Henry Wallace, a career officer possessing a doctorate in history who spoke fluent German from university studies in Heidelberg before the war. He positioned himself at the administration building entrance as trucks delivered their human cargo, his bearing professional yet not antagonistic. "You shall be treated according to Geneva Convention protocols," he declared in German, requiring no translator, his accent refined, his vocabulary exact. "You shall labor, you shall be fed, you shall be housed appropriately. We possess one additional amenity most camps provide, access to radio transmissions. Evening reports in German, BBC programming, music. Information is not a weapon to be feared. It is simply information." The German captive stood in formation, Yorkshire wind slicing through damp uniforms, attempting to comprehend his meaning. Access to radio transmissions, this had to be the psychological manipulation they'd been warned against. British propaganda pumped directly into their barracks, refined deceptions engineered to masquerade as truth. The trap was transparent. Or so they believed. Major Wallace dismissed them to barracks. The huts were elementary yet sufficient, timber bunks, thin mattresses, small coal stoves for warmth, windows with shutters, and in the corner of each barracks, mounted upon a shelf, a radio. A simple timber box with dials and a speaker. Nothing impressive, yet its presence dominated the chamber like ordnance that might detonate at any instant. "Don't touch it," an older captive, Hauptmann Friedrich Steiner, cautioned immediately. He numbered 45 years, a career soldier who had fought in the First War and this one, who had witnessed propaganda's effects, who trusted nothing from enemy sources. "That's precisely what they desire. They'll broadcast deceptions until we commence believing them," refined British psychological warfare. But radio occupied every barracks, untouched, avoided, regarded with suspicion by men who had been trained to perceive British intelligence as poison, regardless of how rational it sounded. The mess hall radio was different, it couldn't be evaded. It occupied the front of the dining area, and on the third evening, a British corporal activated it during supper. Not requesting permission, merely rotating the dial until German voices flooded the chamber, speaking from London. The entire mess hall froze. 300 men ceased eating mid-bite, forks suspended, conversations expiring instantly. They listened despite themselves, despite training, despite propaganda that screamed this was manipulation. A German-language broadcaster, clearly native German, accent suggesting Hamburg, delivered the evening reports. "Good evening. This is the BBC German service broadcasting from London. Today's reports: Allied forces continue advance in Holland. German defensive positions near Arnhem are under sustained assault. In the Pacific Theater, American forces have secured additional positions in the Philippines. In domestic news, the British Ministry of Food has announced increased rations for essential workers." Ernst listened, awaiting the obvious fabrications, the clumsy propaganda, the manipulation tactics. But the report seemed factual, reporting Allied advances honestly, which made sense, but also acknowledging German defensive successes where they existed, noting British domestic challenges, not claiming imminent German collapse, not promising impossible Allied victories, just reports, intelligence delivered in neutral tone, well-researched, properly sourced. When the transmission concluded after 15 minutes, the mess hall remained silent for several heartbeats. Then conversations resumed, but the tone had transformed. Uncertainty had penetrated the barracks, infiltrating certainty that had seemed unshakable. That night, Ernst inscribed in his hidden notebook. "Today we heard British radio for the first time. I anticipated deceptions, obvious propaganda. Instead, professional news reporting that seems factual. Is this refined manipulation, deceptions so expertly crafted they masquerade as truth? Or is it conceivable that BBC transmissions are actually more honest than German radio ever was? I don't know what to believe anymore." The pattern repeated nightly, radio transmissions during supper, German language programming that included reports but also music, cultural programs, even comedy shows that seemed designed simply to entertain rather than indoctrinate. The British Guards never compelled anyone to listen, never lectured about content, never used radio programming as an overt re-education tool. The radio simply existed, available, broadcasting intelligence that captives could choose to accept or reject. But choosing became harder daily because the reports proved accurate. When the BBC reported Allied advances, German captives laboring on local farms heard confirmation from British civilians. When the BBC reported German defensive successes, British soldiers acknowledged them without shame. When the BBC reported setbacks in Allied operations, they did so honestly, not concealing problems or pretending everything proceeded perfectly. The consistency was unnerving. Truth, even when truth was complicated or uncomfortable, seemed to be the broadcasting standard. Ernst formed a connection among the guards, not truly friendship, boundaries remained clear, but something approaching intellectual respect. His name was Sergeant David Mitchell, a former schoolteacher from Yorkshire who commanded adequate German from tutoring refugees before the war. Mitchell supervised work details with casual professionalism, and one afternoon, while captives repaired farm fences, conversation turned to the radio transmission that dominated barracks discussions. "Why do you permit us to hear the BBC?" Ernst asked. "Surely you understand that providing captives access to intelligence is dangerous." Mitchell hammered another fence post into position, considering his response. "Depends on the intelligence, doesn't it? If we were broadcasting fabrications, yes, dangerous because you'd detect them eventually and trust nothing we declared. But BBC broadcasts facts. So the danger isn't that you'll hear deceptions, it's that you'll hear truth and have to reconcile it with what you were told before arriving here. German radio declares BBC is propaganda, and BBC declares German radio is propaganda. The difference is you can now listen to both and determine for yourself which one is telling you the truth." He paused. "We're not afraid of intelligence. We're confident that when people possess access to facts, they'll reach reasonable conclusions." This conversation planted seeds that grew through the following weeks. Ernst began listening more carefully to BBC German service transmissions, comparing them mentally to what German radio had told him before capture, and disturbing patterns emerged. BBC had reported the July 20th assassination attempt on Hitler, which German radio had mentioned but minimized. The BBC reported it fully, including implications. BBC discussed Allied setbacks honestly, failed operations, tactical defeats, logistical problems. German radio had claimed endless German victories even as Germany was clearly losing ground. BBC acknowledged British problems, food shortages, bombing damage, war weariness. German radio had insisted Britain was collapsing when clearly it wasn't. The transformation didn't happen uniformly. Some captives like Hauptmann Steiner refused to listen, insisting all BBC transmissions were refined deceptions. Others began listening obsessively, hungry for intelligence after years of propaganda starvation. Ernst fell somewhere between, listening carefully, comparing sources when possible, attempting to determine what was actually authentic versus what he'd been programmed to believe. In October, something happened that crystallized the shift for many captives. The BBC German service broadcast a special program in which German correspondents read on air. Letters from German POWs in Britain to families back home, transmitted via Red Cross channels and read over the radio, so families would know their loved ones were alive and well treated. This was verifiable. Captives could confirm these were genuine letters from genuine captives. If the BBC fabricated reports, why broadcast something so easily verified as authentic? The logic was inescapable. Ernst found himself in the barracks common room one evening listening to the BBC with a dozen others when his own letter was read, his words written 3 weeks earlier, transmitted across Europe to his wife in Stuttgart. The transmission even provided his POW registration number, his location, and the message he'd carefully crafted. When it finished, he sat stunned. They had taken his personal words and broadcast them faithfully, no editing for propaganda purposes, no manipulation, just transmission of intelligence. Why would an organization dedicated to deceptions do that? They're attempting to make us trust them, Hauptmann Steiner insisted when Ernst mentioned this. They broadcast your letter honestly so you'll believe everything else they declare, classic manipulation. But Ernst wasn't convinced. Or they broadcast honestly because that's simply their standard. Because they believe accuracy matters more than propaganda advantage. The debate consumed the barracks. Every evening men listened to BBC transmissions, then argued for hours about what they'd heard. Some insisted every word was manipulation. Others gradually accepted that BBC was simply more honest than German radio had ever been. Still others refused to listen at all, afraid of being corrupted by enemy intelligence. The camp became a laboratory for testing propaganda versus truth, with radio transmissions as the experimental variable. Sergeant Mitchell noticed the transformation happening among captives. One afternoon, supervising a work detail clearing drainage ditches, he mentioned it to Ernst. "I've witnessed this in other camps. Men arrive certain we're fabricating, certain German radio tells truth. Then they listen to BBC for a few weeks and certainty fractures. Not because we force anything, but because consistent exposure to factual intelligence makes propaganda impossible to maintain. How do you know BBC is truthful? Perhaps you're as indoctrinated as we were." Mitchell smiled slightly. "Fair question. But consider this, BBC reports British problems openly, reports Allied failures honestly. If they were pure propaganda, why acknowledge setbacks? Why not claim perfect victories always? The fact they report accurately when truth is uncomfortable suggests they report accurately when truth is comfortable too." Ernst had no response to this logic. It was precisely the question he'd been wrestling with for weeks. Why would propaganda admit its own failures? December brought deeper cold and darker reports. BBC German service began broadcasting detailed accounts of concentration camps being discovered as Allies advanced. Not vague rumors, but specific reports with locations, numbers, eyewitness testimonies. The transmissions were careful, factual, horrifying. Ernst listened with growing dread, wanting to dismiss it as Allied propaganda but unable to ignore the accumulating specificity, names, places, dates, details that propaganda couldn't simply invent without being disproven. The barracks divided over this intelligence. Some captives insisted it was all fabrications, that camps were simply labor facilities, that Allied powers were inventing atrocities to justify the war. Others remembered things they'd heard, whispers and rumors suppressed, and began accepting that something terrible had happened in Germany's name. The arguments became heated, sometimes violent, until British guards had to intervene. Major Wallace called an assembly one cold January morning. Snow fell across the compound, rendering everything white and quiet. German captives stood in formation, breath visible in cold air, while Wallace stood on a platform with his translator beside him. "You've been listening to BBC transmissions for 4 months now," he declared in German. "Some of you accept what you hear, some reject it, some remain uncertain. That's expected. You've been exposed to propaganda for years. Distinguishing truth from deceptions takes time." The captives listened, silent but attentive. "I want to address the concentration camp reports specifically because they seem to cause the most conflict. We are not fabricating these reports. We are documenting what our forces discover as we advance through Europe, camps where millions were killed systematically, gas chambers, mass graves, industrial-scale murder." His voice remained steady, clinical. "Some of you don't believe this. You think it's Allied propaganda. I understand that impulse. It's easier to believe your nation couldn't do such things than to accept the evidence." He paused, letting translation catch up. But evidence doesn't care about what's easier to believe. It simply exists. And as more camps are discovered, as more documentation emerges, the evidence becomes impossible to deny. BBC broadcasts this intelligence not to make you feel guilty, not to punish you psychologically, but because it's authentic and truth matters more than comfortable deceptions. When you eventually return to Germany, you will witness the evidence yourselves. You will walk through destroyed camps. You will read documented records. You will hear testimony from survivors. And you will have to reconcile what you witness with what you believed. The question isn't whether these crimes happened. The question is whether you were complicit, whether you could have known, whether you chose not to see. His voice softened slightly. These are hard questions. But avoiding them doesn't make them disappear. That evening the barracks was quieter than usual. Men sat on bunks, lost in thought, processing intelligence that couldn't be unheard. Ernst inscribed in his notebook. Today Major Wallace told us the concentration camp reports are genuine. Part of me still wants to believe it's deceptions, refined Allied propaganda. But I'm starting to realize that I've been fabricated to so consistently by German radio that I can no longer trust my own judgment about what's authentic. If BBC is propaganda, it's the most refined I've ever encountered, so refined it includes admitting Allied failures and British problems. Or perhaps, just perhaps, it's not propaganda at all. Perhaps it's just honest reporting. And if that's authentic, what does it mean about everything else I believed? The transmissions continued through winter into spring. BBC German service expanded its programming, adding educational content, language lessons, cultural programs. The British Guards never forced participation, never used radio access as reward or punishment. The transmissions simply existed, offering intelligence to anyone willing to listen. And gradually the camp population divided into three groups: those who refused to listen, those who listened obsessively, and those like Ernst who listened carefully and tried to discern truth through comparison and logic. In March, something remarkable happened. BBC German service broadcast a live debate between two German intellectuals, both broadcasting from London, both anti-Nazi exiles, arguing about how Germany should be rebuilt after the war. They disagreed fundamentally on approach, on philosophy, on methods. The debate was genuine, passionate, full of intellectual rigor. And the BBC broadcast it without interference, without choosing sides, simply providing a platform for ideas to compete. Ernst listened with fascination. This wasn't propaganda. This was intellectual discourse, the kind that had been impossible in Germany for years. These men were arguing openly, disagreeing vehemently, and the British simply permitted them. No one dictated correct positions. No one silenced dissenting views. They just talked, debated, tried to convince through argument rather than authority. When had German radio ever allowed such free exchange? That night Ernst approached Hauptmann Steiner, the older officer who still insisted everything was manipulation. Listen to tonight's transmission. Two Germans arguing about Germany's future. No BBC interference, no propaganda, just debate. How do you explain that if BBC is pure manipulation? Steiner's face showed the strain of months holding on to certainty against accumulating doubt. They're attempting to confuse us, make us think they value free thought. But it's still manipulation, just more refined than we expected. Or, Ernst declared quietly, they actually do value free thought. And that's why they're going to triumph. By summer the transformation was visible across the camp. Men who had arrived certain of German victory, certain of British fabrications, and certain of propaganda truths were now questioning everything. The radio transmissions had done what no interrogation could achieve, they'd made men doubt their certainties by exposing them to consistent, verifiable truth. Not all captives changed. Some clung to old beliefs desperately. But many began the painful process of accepting that they'd been systematically fabricated for years. Sergeant Mitchell commented on this transformation during a work detail in July. Radio transmissions are the most effective re-education tool we possess. Not because we use them to propagandize, but because we don't. We just broadcast facts consistently. And facts have their own power. Propaganda can't survive prolonged exposure to truth. Why do you trust that we won't use this intelligence against you? That we won't take what we learn from BBC and use it somehow? Mitchell shrugged. Because intelligence isn't dangerous when it's accurate. The danger comes from deceptions, from distortions. We're confident enough in our position that we're not afraid of you knowing the truth. Your propaganda feared truth, which is why it kept you in darkness. That difference tells you everything you need to know about who was correct. In August the war ended. Japan surrendered, and suddenly after 6 years, all fighting everywhere ceased. At Camp 17, BBC German service broadcast the reports with typical precision, factual, detailed, and acknowledging both Allied relief and German devastation. Major Wallace called another assembly, standing in summer sunshine that seemed at odds with the gravity of the instant. The war is concluded, he declared. Repatriation will commence over the coming months. Until departure, camp operations continue as before, including radio access. He paused. When you return to Germany, you will find a country divided among occupation powers. Each zone will be governed differently. But one thing I can promise, in the British zone we will continue providing access to uncensored intelligence. Because we believe that democracy requires informed citizens, that freedom requires truth, and that people capable of hearing facts are capable of making sound decisions. He gestured toward the barracks, where radios played throughout every evening. You've spent nearly a year listening to BBC transmissions. Some of you now trust them, some still don't. That's your choice. But I want you to understand what you've experienced here: access to intelligence without censorship, reports delivered honestly even when truth is uncomfortable, and debate without predetermined conclusions. This is what free societies provide. This is why we fought. This is what we're offering Germany, the chance to rebuild as a society that values truth over propaganda. That evening Ernst sought out Sergeant Mitchell one final time before repatriation preparation began. They stood at the camp fence, watching the sunset over the Yorkshire hills, listening to BBC's evening transmission drifting from the barracks across the compound. "I need to thank you," Ernst declared. "Not for compassion exactly, though you showed that, but for something more important, for providing us access to truth. For trusting that we could handle intelligence honestly presented. For not concealing reality behind propaganda because you thought we couldn't handle it." Mitchell nodded. "Truth is the foundation of everything else. Without it you can't build anything lasting. We gave you access to BBC transmissions because we believe people deserve truth, even enemies, even captives. What you did with that truth was up to you. What do I do with the guilt? The realization that my country did terrible things that I might have known if I'd been brave enough to question propaganda. Use it. Let it motivate you to never accept comfortable deceptions again. To always question, always seek truth, and always demand genuine intelligence over propaganda. That's how you honor the people who perished because others believed fabrications." He paused. "And when you return to Germany, tell people about BBC. Tell them that British radio broadcast honestly, even to enemies. Tell them that access to uncensored intelligence is possible. That societies can function on truth rather than propaganda. That's how you help rebuild something superior." Repatriation began in September. Groups of captives were processed, given travel documents, and loaded onto trucks heading south. Ernst's group was scheduled for October, almost exactly a year after his arrival. The final weeks felt strange. Men wandered the camp attempting to memorize it, understanding they were leaving a place where they'd experienced something rare, consistent exposure to unfiltered truth. The night before departure, many captives gathered in barracks' common rooms to listen to BBC one final time. The transmissions had become familiar, even comforting in their consistency, reports delivered factually, music played without propaganda, and intelligence presented without manipulation. For men who had lived years under constant propaganda, this honesty had become remarkable simply by being normal. Ernst inscribed in his notebook one final time. "Tomorrow I return to Germany. I carry with me a year of listening to BBC transmissions that challenged everything I thought I knew. These transmissions didn't convince me through manipulation or force. They simply presented facts consistently, and facts accumulated until propaganda couldn't survive their weight. I'm returning home as a different person than I was when captured. Not because the British re-educated me, but because they gave me access to truth and trusted me to recognize it. That trust, more than anything, transformed me. The journey back to Germany was long, ships across the Channel, trains through France, arriving finally in a country that resembled photographs of the world's end. Rubble everywhere, cities reduced to shells, people moving through ruins like specters. The occupation zones carved Germany into pieces, each governed by different powers with different philosophies. Ernst returned to Stuttgart, now in the American zone, though British and American approaches to intelligence proved similarly open. His family had survived, living in a basement because their building was destroyed. That first night by candlelight, Ernst told them about Camp 17, about BBC transmissions that proved more honest than German radio, and about learning to distinguish truth from propaganda through exposure to consistent factual reporting. His wife listened as if he were describing another planet. "You trust British radio more than German?" she asked, confusion evident. "I trust accurate reporting more than propaganda, regardless of source. And BBC proved more accurate than German radio ever was. That's not betrayal. That's just recognizing reality." In the months that followed, Ernst found work with the American occupation authorities, his language skills and administrative experience making him valuable. He helped establish radio stations in the American zone, working with both American and British broadcasting professionals who taught him that honest journalism required standards, verification, multiple sources, acknowledgement of uncertainty, and willingness to correct errors. These standards had never existed in German broadcasting during the Nazi years. They'd been deliberately eliminated in favor of propaganda. Ernst became an advocate for press freedom in reconstructing Germany. He wrote articles, gave speeches, and argued that democracy required informed citizens and informed citizens required access to uncensored intelligence. He told everyone about his experience at Camp 17, about BBC transmissions that transformed his understanding by simply presenting facts consistently. Many Germans weren't ready to hear this message. They preferred blaming defeat on military failures rather than examining how propaganda had poisoned their understanding of reality. But some listened, and slowly standards for honest journalism began taking root in post-war Germany. Hauptmann Steiner, who had never trusted BBC transmissions, returned to Germany still believing in propaganda certainties. He struggled in post-war chaos, unable to adapt, unable to accept that the world he believed in was built on fabrications. He perished in 1947, bitter and confused, never reconciling what he'd been told with what actually happened. Sergeant David Mitchell continued serving in Germany through the occupation years, helping establish BBC German service transmission stations throughout the British zone. He trained German journalists in BBC standards, accuracy over ideology, verification over assumption, truth over comfortable deceptions. His German students later became influential voices in rebuilding German media as a free press rather than a propaganda organ. Major Henry Wallace rose to prominence in British intelligence services, specializing in understanding how propaganda functioned and how to counter it. His insight was simple: propaganda couldn't survive prolonged exposure to truth. The solution wasn't counter-propaganda but consistent, honest reporting. This philosophy influenced British information policy throughout the Cold War years. What happened at Camp 17 and similar facilities was not widely documented for decades. It didn't fit comfortable narratives about punishment and redemption. But it was genuine. German POWs were given access to BBC transmissions. Those transmissions presented intelligence honestly even when truth was uncomfortable for broadcasters. And that exposure to uncensored intelligence transformed many captives more effectively than any forced re-education program could have. Historians later noted that German POWs held in British camps returned home with transformed perspectives on information access. They had experienced something impossible under Nazi rule: honest news reporting that acknowledged problems, admitted failures, and presented facts without ideological filter. This experience planted seeds that grew into post-war Germany's commitment to press freedom, to public broadcasting standards, and to information access as a democratic right. The camp where Ernst Bauer spent 12 months no longer exists. The buildings were dismantled, and the land returned to farmland. If you visited the site today, you would witness only fields, perhaps sheep grazing. But the impact of what happened there ripples forward. Every journalist Ernst trained to value truth over propaganda, every broadcasting standard Mitchell helped establish, every German who learned that access to uncensored intelligence was possible, and that societies could function on truth rather than deceptions. The German captives who first heard BBC transmissions expected obvious propaganda, clumsy fabrications disguised as reports. What they heard instead was something that challenged their fundamental assumptions, honest reporting that presented facts without ideological manipulation, that acknowledged uncertainty without claiming false certainty, and that admitted failures without pretending perfection. And in that gap between expectation and reality, transformation became possible. Not immediate, not universal, but genuine. That is the quiet victory that no military campaign can achieve alone. That is the transformation that happens one truthful transmission at a time, one factual report at a time, one instant of recognition that propaganda cannot survive prolonged exposure to reality. In the end, it wasn't British military superiority that defeated Nazi ideology in those captives' minds. It was the simple experience of hearing honest news reporting after years of propaganda, of being trusted with uncensored intelligence, of learning that truth could be more powerful than comfortable deceptions. That is the lesson that echoes across decades. That is the truth that survives when propaganda is forgotten. That is the hope that remains when everything else has been destroyed. Information is not determined by who broadcasts it, but by whether it's accurate. Trust is not demanded but earned through consistent honesty. Freedom requires access to truth, even when truth is uncomfortable, even when truth challenges power, even when truth undermines comfortable certainties. The captives who departed Camp 17 in late 1945 carried that lesson home, back to a destroyed nation that needed to learn it more desperately than anything else in its history. Some shared it through journalism. Some lived it through demanding press freedom. Some passed it on to children and grandchildren. And somewhere in that chain of transformation, Germany became something different from what it was. Not perfect, not redeemed, but superior. Superior because people learned that truth matters more than propaganda. That information access is the foundation of freedom. That societies built on honest reporting are stronger than societies built on comfortable deceptions. That in the space between propaganda and reality, democracy becomes possible. And sometimes that possibility arrives through a simple timber radio broadcasting from London.